And the good times just keep on rolling on day 11 of the Julian Assange extradition hearing. Yes, come see the threat to all of journalism that's being ignored by pretty much all journalists, with a few exceptions like Craig Murray here, who once again is giving us a very detailed account of what went on. And just the crazy thing the prosecution is doing, particularly this James Lewis QC guy. Oh, we've been following his crap for days, haven't we? So he starts off with yet another shocking abuse of court procedure. He had been permitted gratuitously to read to two previous witnesses with zero connection to this claim an extract from a book by Luke Harding and David Lee, in which Harding claims that at a dinner at El Moro restaurant, Julian Assange had stated he did not care if U.S. informants were killed because they were traitors who deserved what was coming to them. We mentioned this in an earlier video. I gave you a little spoiler and said it was false. Well, we're getting to that now, but understand he's just reading this out. In court terms, this is hearsay. I mean, unless he actually puts Luke Harding and David Lee on the stand to be subject to cross-examination by the defense, then, you know, what's that all about? Oh, okay, well, here's a guy who says that, Julian Assange committed the great train robbery. Well, what does that mean? Okay, so witness today is John Getz. He was at that dinner. He was actually there. He was ready and willing to testify that Julian said no such thing and that Luke Harding is not unusually lying. Getz was not permitted by Judge Bereitzer to testify on this point, even though two witnesses who were not present had previously been asked to testify on it. So Judge Dalek's rationale was that it was not in his written evidence statement submitted before Lewis had raised the question, so Getz was only permitted to contradict Lewis's deliberate introduction of a lie if Lewis asked him. Sorry, no, it doesn't work that way. Witnesses are allowed to give what's called rebuttal evidence, which means that even if that isn't the reason why the witness was called to the stand, if the witness has knowledge that something that the prosecution, for example in this case, had said that was incorrect, the defense gets to ask him about it. You get rebuttal. But Lewis refused to ask the one witness who was actually present what had happened because Lewis knew the lie he is propagating would be exposed. Oh my God. Do they have anything in England resembling disbarment procedures? Like they do in America? Like the prosecutor prosecuting the Duke lacrosse team for rape when he knew it was false and he knew that the accuser was lying through her eye teeth and he withheld all this exculpatory evidence and things like that. Yeah, he got totally disbarred. Too quick to talk about. There needs to be something like that over in the UK if there isn't, and this guy should be subject to it. So, yeah, Murray recounts doing that with Clive Stafford Smith and Mark Feldstein, and we covered those, but he says James Lewis QC knew that these witnesses had absolutely no connection to this conversation, and he put it to them purely to get the lie into court record and into public discourse. Not that anyone's actually talking about this, but James Lewis QC also knows that Getz was present on the occasion described. The Harding book describes the exact date and location of the dinner, and that it included two German journalists, and Getz was one of them. It is plainly contrary to natural justice that a participant in an event introduced into the proceedings should not be allowed to tell the truth about it when those with no connection are, tendentiously, invited to. Whatever the rules of evidence may say, Bereitzer and Lewis have here contrived between them a blatant abuse of process. It is a further example of the egregious injustices of this process. Are you angry yet? Are you outraged? But wait, there's more. Daniel Ellsberg himself was to give evidence this afternoon. Edward Fitzgerald QC applied for his video link evidence to be heard at 3:15 p.m., which is 7:15 a.m. in California where Dan lives. But Judge Dalek insisted it could not be put back beyond 2:30 p.m., thus forcing an 89-year-old man to give evidence at 6:30 a.m. Simply stunning. As it happens, Murray says, when Dan is 108 and on his deathbed, he will still be able to outwit James Lewis QC while reading Moby Dick and playing the ukulele, but the continual and cynical lack of concern for the defense just keeps punching you in the face. So, we're starting with Getz. In June 2010, he went to London to meet with WikiLeaks and The Guardian to work on the Afghan war logs. In a series of meetings in the bunker at The Guardian with the NYT and other major media partners, the partnership was formed whereby all would pool effort in researching the Afghan war logs, but each party would choose and publish his own stories. This cooperative venture between 5 major news organizations, normally rivals, was unique at the time. Getz had been struck by what seemed to him Julian Assange's obsession with the security of the material. He insisted everything was encrypted and strict protocols were in place for handling the material. This had been new territory for the journalists. And we saw the same thing with Edward Snowden. You remember when he was giving evidence to Glenn Greenwald and other people at The Guardian, he had to teach them things like how to use PGP to encrypt their emails. He had to educate them on cybersecurity and how it all worked because they didn't know. Most people didn't know. Most people still don't know. The New York Times was tasked with liaison with the White House, the Department of Defense, and State Department on questions of handling the material. Despite what we've all been told for all this time, and what the prosecution has been saying for all this time, according to Getz, Assange had been most concerned to find the names in the papers. He spent a lot of time working out technical ways to identify names in the tens of thousands of documents. Mark Summers asked if he had been looking for the names for the purpose of redaction, and Getz confirmed it was for redaction. Remember, the myth is that Manning gave Assange all the documents and Assange just published them. He just put them out there with no regard for anyone's safety or anything. Lie. Big lie. I mean, we've known it's a lie, but again, here it is in court, under testimony, confirmed it's a lie. So Eric Schmidt of the NYT had been speaking to the White House. He had sent an email identifying 15,000 documents the White House did not want published to prevent harm to individuals or to American interests. It was agreed not to publish these documents, and they were not published. Summers asked Getz if he was aware of any names that slipped through, and he replied not. But when a large number of these were released in the USA under a FOIA request, it was seen that WikiLeaks had redacted those they had released more heavily than the Department of Defense did. So yeah, it was the Department of Defense that gave out publicly a lot of these names that were supposedly so dangerous too. Names that Assange had redacted. Getz recalled an email from David Lee of The Guardian stating that publication of some stories was delayed because the amount of time WikiLeaks was devoted to the redaction process to get rid of the bad stuff. So there's confirmation that David Lee was lying too. He knew Assange was redacting. German citizen El Masri had been kidnapped in Skopje, flown shackled and hooded around the world, subjected to constant beatings and torture, eventually ending up in what he believed to be a U.S. detention facility in Afghanistan. At the time, his claims had been pretty difficult to believe. And Murray says, if I might inject a personal note here, this is around the time I myself blew the whistle on the torture program as a UK ambassador. I was effectively called a liar by then Foreign Secretary Jack Straw to Parliament, who described the extraordinary rendition program as a conspiracy theory. I know how hard it was to be believed then. So, Getz's investigations had shown the story to be true. Using rendition flight logs and hotel records, he even managed to track the perpetrators to North Carolina and had spoken to some of them there. Enough evidence was produced for arrest warrants against 13 American agents or soldiers to be issued in Munich. Summers asked Getz whether they were arrested. He replied that no, to their surprise, nothing was done to deliver the arrest warrant to the USA. And then the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables were released. They had been able to see the pressure brought on the German government not to deliver the arrest warrant. The U.S. had told Germany that to do so would have serious repercussions for the U.S.-German relationship. And that would have been under George W. Bush. WikiLeaks had brought in a second phase of local media partners in the third countries involved, who might better be able both to redact and to know what were the important stories for a local audience. This had introduced some delays, which were frustrating for Getz. Summers asked how thorough the process of redaction was. Getz said the original strict protocols remained in place, and he did not know of anybody who had come to any harm. The State Department was actively engaged in the process. P.J. Crowley and others would call and request redactions and omissions. These were made. Eventually, though, a decision was taken by the U.S. government to withdraw cooperation. Bareister issued a time warning. Sorry, defense, you only get so long to speak. So Summers went on to ask about what led to the actual publication of the unredacted cables. And that was when Luke Harding and David Lee published a book in 2011 containing the password to the online cache of encrypted cables. This was discussed on various mirroring sites and eventual publication of the full cache by Cryptome after DeFreitag became involved. Cryptome was at the time very well known and an important source for journalists. Summers then asked about the breakdown of relationships between WikiLeaks and The Guardian. It was at this point that Bereitzer ruled that Summers was not allowed to ask about what happened at the dinner he attended at El Mora restaurant. Summers made a formal request as Lewis had introduced the subject with other witnesses who, unlike Getz, had not been there. Lewis objected and Judge Dalek said no. Yes, Judge Dalek is back in all her psychopathic glory. So James Lewis then cross-examines. So it gets referred to his earlier evidence on the releasing of the password and said that Cryptome published first. Lewis countered that on 29 August 2011, WikiLeaks had released 133,877 cables, together with a statement that this was done in accordance with WikiLeaks' commitment to maximizing impact and making information available to all. This was 2 days before Cryptome published. A rather chaotic period ensued. Julian cried out from the dock that this was a misquote. He was warned that he would be excluded from court by Judge Dalek. And remember, she had said earlier that the whole reason why he was allowed to be kept at that little dock at the back and not up there informing his lawyers of things was that he could just call out at any time he wanted to let his lawyers know something they needed to know. And again, he does it, and again, she shuts him down. But it turned out, guess what? It was a misquote. And if you read through Murray's blog post, you'll get the full story on that. But there was then some rather confused questioning between Getz and Lewis, of which the upshot was that those were unclassified and or redacted cables, a quarter of the cache. Getz said he could not comment to Lewis's suggestion that some had names marked Strictly Protect. Not an expert, but I don't think Strictly Protect is a classification in the U.S. government. Lewis suggested that after the collaboration, the material was just dumped. Getz said no. WikiLeaks had invested a lot of time, money, and staff resources into the program, and from detailed discussions, he knew they intended it to continue to roll out for at least another year. Then, Cryptome had published. So he asked Getz whether the 15,000 cables had also been dumped. Getz replied they were not cables, they were Afghan war logs, and no, not to his knowledge. Lewis then said there was evidence that called Assange thoughtful, humorous, and energetic. Did Getz agree? He said yes. Lewis then quoted Christine Assange on what a good father her son was and invited Getz to comment. Getz replied he was in no position to know. And Murray, like me, is kind of confused as to why he's asking that. Why is he asking about why the defendant is such a great guy? And Murray says possibly to counter psychiatric evidence? You know, to say that he's actually in good of a mind to be stuck in administrative segregation or whatever it is they call solitary confinement, because they don't want to call it solitary confinement, which is what it is. So, re-examination by Mark Summers. While the cables redaction process was going on, no names at risk had been published. To his knowledge, nobody had ever been harmed as a result of publication. He knew from his close involvement that Assange had tried very hard to prevent the publication of the unredacted cables. He had pleaded with DeFreitag. Again, the exact opposite of what we're told. Are you used to it now? Do you get that this is what happens? What have I been saying all along? All right. Next witness, Dan Ellsberg himself, the man, the myth, the legend. He of the Pentagon Papers, yes. The famous case on prior restraint on publication. And there had also been a less well-known criminal case against him personally under the Espionage Act. That was dismissed with prejudice by the court. Ellsberg said he saw extremely strong parallels with his own case. These papers had the capability of informing the public of the progress of the war and the limited possibility that it could be brought to a successful conclusion at all. You remember what we were told when it all started? Oh, it'll just be a couple of months. We'll be in and out of there. Yeah, this will be easy. And we're still there. Yeah. Said the same thing about Iraq, too. Well, the Afghan war logs showed operational level information, not a wider view, but the effect was similar. He strongly identified with both the source and the process of publication. And Assange absolutely held political opinions relevant to this publication, because remember, if this is political, they don't get to extradite him. You know, and the prosecution's been saying, oh, no, this isn't political, nothing political about it. Give me a break. How stupid do you think we are? So Ellsberg said it was absurd for the prosecution to argue otherwise. He himself had been motivated by his political views in his publication, and Assange's views were very similar. He had held very interesting discussions with Assange and felt a great affinity with him. They both believed there was a great lack of transparency to the public over government decisions. The public were fed much information that was false. When the public had so little genuine information and were fed so much false information, real democracy was not possible. An example was the Iraq War, clearly an illegal war of aggression in breach of the UN Charter, sold on lies to the public. The Afghan war logs were similar to low-level reports Ellsberg had himself written in Vietnam. It was the same thing, the invasion and occupation of a foreign country against the wishes of the majority of its population. That could only bring defeat or endless conflict. 19 years so far. The war logs had exposed a pattern of war crimes, torture, assassination, and death squads. The one thing that had changed since Vietnam was that these things were now so normalized they were classified below top secrets. All the Pentagon Papers were top secret. None of the WikiLeaks documents were. Alright, then going on to the collateral murder video, Ellsberg stated that it definitely showed murder, including the deliberate machine gunning of a wounded and unarmed civilian. That it was murder was undoubted. The dubious word was collateral, which implies accidental. What was truly shocking about it was the Pentagon reaction that these war crimes were within the rules of engagement, which permitted murder. Edward Fitzgerald asked whether Ellsberg was allowed to put forward the question of intention at his trial. He replied no, the distribution of classified material outside those designated to receive it was an offense of strict liability under the 1917 Espionage Act. This was absolutely inappropriate to trials of whistleblowers. And he quotes, "I did not get a fair trial, and nor have recent whistleblowers in the USA. Julian Assange could not get a fair trial." Back to James Lewis QC cross-examining, Lewis said Assange was not being prosecuted for publication of the collateral murder video. Ellsberg said that the collateral murder video was essential to an understanding of the rules of engagement. Lewis countered that Assange was not being charged for publication of the rules of engagement. He was only being charged for publication of unredacted names of those who might come to harm, so we keep falling right back on this. I've told you guys about this before, the Motte and the Bailey. For those of you who aren't familiar with this analogy, back in medieval times you had the bailey, which was like a courtyard or even sometimes the size of a small village, and that was kind of where the people went, and the feudal lord spent most of his time, mingling among the people. That was kind of his little environment there. That was his village. That was where he lived. His actual keep was in a motte up on a hill generally, and surrounded and fortified and everything. The bailey was probably fortified, but not as well fortified as the motte. So, if the village was attacked, then the lord would retreat to the motte, where he was better protected. So, the Motte and Bailey doctrine is a fallacious tactic used by dishonest people like James Lewis QC, where you go and you make all these arguments, and then when you're refuted, you go back to the motte. You go back to the one thing that you think protects you, and that's what he's doing here. I mean, you've heard him say for days all of the other things that he's been accusing Assange of, and all the things that are oh so important, and yet, whenever he's challenged, he retreats back to, oh, no, it's only for publication of unredacted names. But it isn't it? What about all those additional charges that have been brought? That you won't let anyone have a chance to actually look at before they respond to? Yeah. Whatever. The Motte and the Bailey. That's what he's doing. And Kronberg is another mod of his. Yep, he keeps going right back to that. As if Kronberg is the end-all and be-all of truth, the universe throughout. Kronberg said the prosecution was for documents up to secret level containing the names of those who had risked their lives and freedom while helping the USA. Lewis contrasted this with Ellsberg. When you published the Pentagon Papers, you were very careful what you gave to the media. Ellsberg replied that he withheld 3 or 4 volumes not to cause difficulties to diplomatic efforts to end the war. Lewis suggested he was protecting individuals. Ellsberg, this is the guy himself, said no. If he released those documents, the U.S. government might have used it as an excuse to exit diplomacy and continue the war. Lewis asked if there were names in the Pentagon Papers that would risk harm to them. Ellsberg replied, yes. So Lewis asked whether he had read the article, Why WikiLeaks is Not the Pentagon Papers by Floyd Abrams. Ellsberg replied he had read several articles like this by Abrams. He did not know Abrams. But according to Abrams, Ellsberg had withheld 4 volumes, whereas, can anyone doubt that Assange would have published all of them? Ellsberg replied he disagreed. Abrams had never had 1 minute of discussion with him or Assange. Quote, he does not understand my motives at all in his article. The position he outlines is widely held by those who want to criticize Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden while pretending to be liberal. What he writes is simply untrue. Julian Assange withheld 15,000 files. He went through a long, hard process of redaction. He requested help from both the State Department and the Department of Defense on redaction. I have no doubt Julian would have removed the volumes as I did in my place. He had no intention to name names. 10 years later, the U.S. government still has not been able to name one single individual who was actually harmed by the WikiLeaks releases. I was shocked that Kronberg should make that allegation while offering no evidence. As nobody was hurt, clearly the risk was never as high as they claimed, as indeed the document classification would tell you. They said exactly the same of me, Murray writes. They said CIA agents and those helping the USA would be hurt. They said I would have blood on my hands. Actually, Murray writes this up in like early in the morning or really, really late at night or late in the morning after he's staying up. He's been taking notes all day. He's been doing a lot. I really appreciate all the hard work he's put in. But please understand that when he writes this out, he doesn't exactly have the time or the mental energy to correct for grammar and things like that. He's just trying to get the information down. And so I actually am a little bit confused here at this point in the article. I don't know if he's talking about himself with his own whistleblowing activities, or if he's saying what Ellsberg is saying, because the quotes make it a little bit confusing. But either way, that's the truth. That's what happens. That's what they always say. That's the line. It's well rehearsed. You will have blood on your hands. You're putting good and decent people at risk. Yada, 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 yada. Name one. Anyway, there now followed an extraordinary question, in scare quotes, from James Lewis QC, who was permitted to read out about 11 paragraphs from various locations in one of Kronberg's rambling affidavits. Remember, this is the guy who keeps complaining that he only has 4 hours to cross-examine witnesses, even though Judge Dalek only gave the defense half an hour, and yet he spends it just reading out some stuff. So, anyway. The claim is, some U.S. sources that had to leave their homeland, go into hiding, or change their names in a number of countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, China, and Ethiopia. Some individuals in Afghanistan and Iraq had subsequently disappeared. So he says, how can you possibly honestly say that nobody was harmed? Ellsberg. With all these people who felt they were in danger, of course I am sorry it was inconvenient for them, and that is regrettable. But was any one of them actually physically harmed? Did one of them actually suffer the claimed physical consequences? Lewis. You call it regrettable that people were put at risk? Is it your position that there was absolutely no harm caused by the publication of the names of these individuals? Ellsberg. Assange's actions are absolutely antithetical to the notion that he deliberately published these names. Had hundreds been harmed, that would count against the great good done by the publication of the information. No evidence is produced that any actual harm came to them. Of course, some people could not be located in a war that killed 1 million people and displaced 37 million. The government is extremely hypocritical to pretend a concern for them against their general contempt for Middle Eastern lives. They had refused to help redact the names. This is a pretense at concern. Lewis. What about the disappeared? Is it not common sense that some had been forced to disappear or flee under a different name? Ellsberg. It does not seem to me that that small percentage of those named who may have been murdered or fled can necessarily be attributed as a result of WikiLeaks when they are in among more than 1 million who have been murdered and 37 million who have fled. So, re-examination. Fitzgerald took Ellsberg to a passage in the Kronberg affidavit which stated that the U.S. government could not positively attribute any death to the WikiLeaks material. It's in Kronberg, it's in the Bible, it's in the Holy Writ, Lewis. You're just not picking and choosing the parts of the Bible you like to believe, are you? Ellsberg said that this was his understanding and had been said at the Manning trial. He was shocked. It was just like Iraqi WMD. He had at first been inclined to believe the government on Iraqi WMD, just as he had first been inclined to believe the government on deaths caused by WikiLeaks releases. In both cases, it had proved they were making it up. And Murray writes, the U.S. government succeeded in preventing eyewitness John Getz from contradicting their promulgation of Luke Harding's lie about what Assange said at El Moro. The U.S. government also objected, successfully so far, to Khaled El-Masri's giving evidence on the grounds that he will allege he was tortured in the USA, given that the European Court of Human Rights and the German courts had both found El-Masri's story to be true. Only in the wacky world of Lewis and Bereitzer could it be considered wrong for him to tell the truth in court. Yeah. Truth has nothing to do with this. This isn't about truth. What were you thinking? What's the matter with you? Nah. Yep, so another day, another couple of outrages. That's how it is in the wild, wild world of the Assange hearing. Oh man, what could possibly be in store for us for day 12? Well, you'll just have to pay attention to the next video in order to find out. I'll go ahead and tell you, spoiler alert, they're going to go into detail about how the names were redacted. And man, no one is going to be able to say that Julian Assange did not do his due diligence there. So in order to do that, please hit like, subscribe, and the bell. And above all, share this video far and wide to get around the shadow banning and the media's just completely ignoring all of this, so please share it everywhere you can and share Murray's blog post everywhere you can. Also comment, because apparently a lot of people are saying that if you comment, it feeds the algorithm. And that kind of gets this around some more. So post comments, post your reactions, and see if we can get this kind of up in the algorithm so we can get a little bit more attention and we can shine more of a light on this. And of course, if you like what I'm doing, please go to donate.bogosity.tv, give whatever you can. We'll see you for day 12. Until then, stay strong and be free.